Welcome to Keep What You Earn, your judgment and jargon-free zone for entrepreneurs of all levels. Get ready to learn how to scale your business, save money in taxes, and create a business that grows your wealth. If it feels like the financial side of business is like eating your vegetables, well then think of this podcast as the ranch dressing to make the process a little more enjoyable. My name is Shannon Weinstein. I'm a CPA and business owner on a mission to simplify money and empower others through knowledge. I hope this episode inspires you to take action, but remember that the information we share is for educational purposes only and is not individual tax advice. Now that we got that out of the way, let's start the show. Imposter syndrome is an interesting thing. It's something that a lot of people struggle with, but they may not be labeling it what it is. And it can be showing up in your life in different facets. It could be that you are feeling insecure about a new promotion or feeling unqualified to be receiving some type of reward or accolade. You feel unqualified for what it is you're doing, feel uncomfortable, not belonging in the rooms that you're in. Whatever way that's showing up for you, we're all feeling it at some point in our entrepreneurial journey. And that's why this episode is so powerful to share more stories from our expert guest, John Mollura. John Mollura is a professional speaker who went from being a literal rocket scientist to a multi-award-winning portrait photographer and a coach. He educates and empowers his keynote and workshop audiences to turn down the volume of imposter syndrome and provides coaching for men to help them stop the endless cycle of what ifs and become men of authentic action. I'm excited to share his content with you today because John is an expert in every paper definition. And even he struggles with imposter syndrome. And we're going to talk about that in today's episode. So without further ado, let's hear from John. Hey, John, welcome to the show.
Hey, thank you so much for having me, Shannon.
Of course. Could you say hello to everybody listening and let them know who you are?
Hey, everybody. My name's John Mollura, coming to you from beautiful, well, not beautiful today, coastal Delaware. We're in the middle of a storm coming in off the ocean. But yeah, I am a professional photographer, former rocket scientist, like legit rocket scientist. So whenever people say this isn't rocket science, I can actually say with authority whether or not it is rocket science.
That's great. And what do you do right now? What is your main focus?
Yeah, so what I've been working on is taking all this experience that I've had, leading teams that have landed things on Mars or working with advanced fighter jets, and then leaving that career after a decade and a half and starting my own photography business and doing that. Taking all those lessons I've learned and all that personal growth experience and helping people unpack imposter syndrome.
Well, one would think that of all the people to struggle with imposter syndrome, a rocket scientist, which is the epitome of the example that we use to describe kind of this ultimate expert in what they do.
Right.
The irony of that is really funny because it's like, if even a rocket scientist has imposter syndrome, none of us are safe from it, right?
That is actually so correct. No one is safe from it, particularly, which I have a feeling this is going to resonate with a lot of your listeners. High achievers are actually the people that are impacted with it the most. I was on an Instagram Live a few weeks ago with a gentleman named William Branham, and he and I were sharing our experiences with imposter syndrome. And the reason why that's of note that he and I were talking about, other than we were trying to normalize this conversation, especially for men, about mental health and about sharing your struggles and locking arms with people, is I'm a former rocket scientist. William was a 26-year veteran of the Navy SEALs.
Wow.
So you have a rocket scientist and a Navy SEAL talking about how we have been, working through imposter syndrome for a lot of our lives, even operating at the elitist of the elite levels.
That's insane. And I say that out of surprise and go, wow, like, guys, even Navy SEALs and rocket scientists have imposter syndrome. We are not alone. Like, we are not any different. And we are definitely all deserving of giving ourselves more credit for that, I think. What do you consider imposter syndrome? How do you describe it and how it shows up?
Great question. And at its root, imposter syndrome is rooted in lack of self-confidence. Specifically, though, imposter syndrome is when you feel like a fake. Despite having degrees, awards, accolades, peer respect, you believe that you're like about ready to be found out, that you're a fake. And all of a sudden this house of cards that you've built up over all these years, despite all this evidence that you're truly incredible at what you do, Someone's going to find out you don't really know what you're doing, and this house of cards is just going to collapse on you. That's imposter syndrome.
I think it stems also from self-doubt in the fact that I've never done this before. This is something new, or this is something maybe you don't think you have the proof that you've done it, even though you're very well equipped to do it. And it just creates this whole sense of fear. I know I struggled with this too.
Right.
When I went off on my own to start my business. It was like, who the hell am I to do this? I don't know what I'm doing. And then I think I slowly realized that like nobody does. Is that what you find as well? That like so many people struggle with this and everyone thinks the others have it figured out?
Oh, absolutely. The numbers that are published for people that have experienced imposter syndrome, they put it around 70 to 80%.
Yeah.
And I would say it's got to be probably closer to like 99%, unless you're completely disconnected from reality. Because you're right. Whenever we get involved in situations, especially situations that are outside of our comfort zone, things that are new for us, it's healthy to feel like, well, maybe I don't know everything, but that's okay. That's one of the ways imposter syndrome can trip people up, is putting them in this state of inertia of being stalled out because you don't, quote, know everything. Well, you're never going to know everything is one of the mantras I've told myself.
Yeah. And as you mentioned that, you mentioned high achievers. And I could definitely see how this affects, it's this irony in a sense of the more you achieve, the more you may actually experience this, because it's probably the more pressure you put on yourself to know more because of how much you've invested or how much you've strived for whatever that may be, whether it's on the verge of knowledge or experience, that you're pursuing something relentlessly. And it's like, if you fall short, I feel like it's more impactful. Would you agree that people like that are more susceptible to experiencing imposter syndrome?
Yeah. And I think that there's a lot of core reasons that can cause it. But yeah, I mean, it's the old adage of the higher you go, the further the fall. But another way to maybe repackage that is, because this is something I struggled with a lot throughout my life, was I believed that, if I made a mistake, a single misstep, I was going to have no safety net. I was going to wind up, abandoned. There was nothing there to catch me. When I think conversely, it's actually the opposite of that. It's the higher you build yourself and the more people respect you and are cheering you on, you probably have a bigger net to catch you if you make a mistake, which it's going to happen sooner or later.
Yeah, I agree. And I think that that you're totally right. Now, how would you describe the people who are typically experiencing imposter syndrome? You mentioned the high achievers, but what are some of the other reasons that people might experience this?
Yeah. So with any kind of, psychological thing that goes on between our ears, the causes can be very complex, but some that I touch on whenever, I'm up on stage or giving a workshop is it could be due to upbringing. Like if you were someone who was raised that, you'd come home and you'd have, good grades, or you did well at the game, you're the greatest kid ever. And then you knock your milk over, and then you kind of ping pong between this like very high, like you're the greatest kid ever. And then it's like, what are you doing? You've totally screwed all this up. That's one way that can manifest itself as an adult in imposter syndrome. Cause you're as a child, when you're developing, you get this kind of ping pong back and forth, which is why I also like to talk to like parents of like kids, like when they're out in the audience, because, so they can realize how their actions, impact their kids. Another thing is that I didn't learn until I was doing my background information, learning about imposter syndrome, putting everything together, was as an adult, it can crop up when we find ourselves in a non-inclusive environment. And by that, I mean, if you're in an environment where you're the only one who looks a certain way, talks a certain way, is a certain gender, you're already naturally like, okay, I'm not like everybody else. And if the leaders of those communities or of the groups are not cognizant of that and work to create an inclusive place, it can really have people feel like a fake. And like, maybe I shouldn't really be here. And I tell the story of a woman named Talisha Laveri. And she organized big events, had a very good reputation, and she had the opportunity to go on a team that was bringing, I think, then President Barack Obama to her alma mater. So she was super psyched to, to partner with her alma mater and bring, a big name speaker like that who she respected. And she got on this team and thought, this is going to be great. This is my dream. And the team was totally toxic. Despite all of her accolades and education and experience, They wouldn't listen to her. They would, I think, get to the point of like ridicule her.
Wow.
So here's someone coming in at the top of their game, and her whole identity was raw. Like, maybe I'm not as good as I thought I was. Maybe I shouldn't really be here. And it put her in this real downward spiral of depression to the point where she considered taking her own life.
Wow.
And I'm pleased to report that she was able to get the help she needed and get out of that environment, and went on to write a book called Tales from Your Token Black Colleague. And it's all about how important creating these inclusive environments are in workplace or communities or places of worship, just so people feel like they truly belong and aren't, quote, a fake.
Yeah, I think that's such a good point, that there's a sense of belonging as well included in that,
Right.
where it's not just internal, like, do I have the experience? Do I have the skills? It's also, am I in the right room? Or do I belong here? And that can be environmentally affected, not just internally. So there's only so much you can do, I think, on the personal development side, if you're in those positions. Like, that's a really good point.
Yeah. Yeah. So as leaders, people that are leading those groups and organizations have a huge responsibility to make sure voices are heard and people are treated with the utmost respect.
Yeah. And I think what you've made as a point with that story is that there are high stakes involved in imposter syndrome and what it can cost you. What are some of the other ways that it can cost us, literally or figuratively, as business owners to struggle with imposter syndrome?
Yeah. So I refer to imposter syndrome as a thief. And I say, imposter syndrome is a thief. It's going to rob you of your joy. It's going to steal your potential, and it's going to cheat the people that you're actually here to serve out of the opportunities you could provide to make their lives better. Now, I'll unpack that a little bit. So when I say it's going to rob you of your joy, years ago, before I even knew what imposter syndrome was, but suffered from it, I was getting an award when I was in engineering, letter of commendation from the U.S. military, which was a huge deal for anyone, but especially as a civilian team. And I remember standing on stage and I was getting ready to receive this letter of commendation. And I all of a sudden had this upwelling of fear, Shannon. I was certain that in front of everybody, the president of the company I worked for was going to look at me and be like, "Oh, John Mollura, we actually all got together and we realized you've been bullshitting us for the past, 6 years that you've been working here. You actually don't deserve this." And despite like looking back on it, or from an outsider looking in, that's ludicrous, right? Because I had the data of what we worked on was successful. It was out doing its mission where it needed to be doing it and doing it successfully. But I just had this core belief that I wasn't worthy and I shouldn't be in this room, as you said, and especially getting an accolade for something that I feel like I just kind of muddled my way through, despite evidence to the contrary.
Yeah, I think that's something that we struggle with a lot. And one thing that I've actually struggled with is the idea of, if I didn't exert a ton of effort, I don't deserve an accolade.
Yeah.
And it's like this idea that unless I worked my tail off, I haven't earned it. And it's this interesting idea that I had to overcome, that earning something didn't have to be done through the hours, the manual labor, the stress, and the burnout. But I've been kind of programmed that way through my career, that the more you do, the more you're worth. And if something came easy to me and I did it quickly, and we struggle with this as accountants, like if we fax 4 pieces of paper to the IRS, we can save a business owner, let's just say like 20 to 40,000.
Right.
But like, we know how to fill out the form. We know what to say. We know who to send it to. And that is one of those areas where like we struggle with it and go, who am I to charge like thousands of dollars for these pieces of paper? And what we have to do is stop associating our value with our effort. And I think that is a piece of the imposter syndrome puzzle, is that we start associating those things and then we feel like we are an imposter, because it's like, who am I to do that? It was so easy for me to do. There's no way I deserve credit for this. Do you see that a lot?
Yeah, absolutely. And that reminds me of an adage, that kind of goes back to my engineering days, where they talk about, some giant ship was in for service and they couldn't get it to work and they needed to get it back out in the water, and no one could figure it out. So they called back one of the old mechanics that used to work there. And he came in and looked at everything and grabbed his tool bag and just pulled out like a, $30 hammer and just hit a couple times in a certain spot and everything, all of a sudden green lights and they're good to go. And they got the bill and it was $20,000. And probably someone from accounts payable called and said, hey, got this bill. It said, labor 15 minutes, but $20,000.
Yes.
What's going on? And he said, well, my time was, $25 an hour, but knowing where to hit the certain spot, that was worth $19,975.
I love that.
But it's so true. And that was a great point about, equating value with our effort. That's something that I, wrestled with myself. Like especially when I was in engineering, before I really got a handle on a lot of this stuff, my hand was always the first to go up for the most difficult projects and missions, or the most potentially hazardous projects and missions, because I thought maybe if I do that well, then maybe I'll believe I'm worthy to be here.
Yeah.
Which unfortunately that wasn't the case. It probably actually had the opposite effect. It's like I just felt more and more like a fake.
Yeah. Let's talk about for a second, because this is coming up for me, the relationship between imposter syndrome and humility. Because I feel that there's a blurry line between the two, where you could have a sense of, it was nothing, don't worry about it. I think we minimize ourselves and our efforts in a way because we don't want to be perceived as, and we don't quite feel that we're either deserving of it, or perhaps it's because, we don't want to be too proud. We don't want to get too excited. We don't want to have an ego. We want to actually silence the ego a little bit. Can you talk a little bit about the relationship between those and how you coach people through that and kind of understanding the difference between them?
Right. So what I like to think about is something I was trained with when I was going through martial arts training, is having that quiet confidence. You don't have to, walk around with the shirt that says I'm number one, tons of fun or whatever you want. But there's something to be said for that quiet confidence where you just carry yourself with. So one of the things that I really get into in the workshops that I do is something seemingly simple, but so powerful. And that's learning to accept a compliment. And I always tell people it's so important to learn to accept a compliment, because when you say something self-deprecating, like I used to play in bands, and if people would say, John, I saw you guys play a couple weekends ago, you guys crushed it. The wrong way to handle that compliment would have been say, oh, thanks, man. How much had you had to drink? Right? Because that's a problem on two different levels, and two very important levels. The first one is that tells your brain, which is always listening to you, sometimes unfortunately, it's reinforcing a negative view of yourself. So when you deflect a compliment or just say, oh, it was no big deal, or, oh yeah, Shannon really carried me on that, or insert any self-deprecating or deflecting phrase you want in there, it reinforces to your brain that, oh, maybe I don't deserve this compliment. So I always say it's very important to learn to accept a compliment in a healthy way. But the person that just went out of their way to give you a compliment, you're kind of throwing it back at them. And then they're like, oh, well, I guess maybe I was wrong, or I guess, insert any negative thing it can bring up, or like, hey, I was trying to do something nice. What the hell?
Yeah, it's discouraging.
Yeah.
It's like, well, then I won't compliment you again because you're not going to accept it.
Right.
Because a lot of the time, think about on the other side of the coin. We would issue a compliment because we genuinely feel that way. I feel like people, yes, you can like kiss ass a little bit, but I think I genuinely, if people are going to go out of their way to say, hey, you did a great job with that, I don't think they're just BSing you. I think there's a reason why they're saying that. And I think they want you to accept it. And like you said, I think that deflecting it is just like, well, then I won't say that again.
Yeah. Yeah. And I remember I was giving a workshop on this once, and we were in this part, and someone said that they've stopped giving compliments to strangers because they got so tired of people just looking at them like they were a weirdo or saying something, just weird back to them. And I would say, well, that's why it's important that I teach people to accept a compliment. So, your listeners might want to write this down because it's pretty complicated. I have a patented 3-step process, Shannon. You want to hear what it is?
Go for it.
All right, cool. So when someone gives you a compliment, the first step is to smile. but don't smile like weird and like awkward and like make it last long. Just give them a nice smile when someone says something nice to you. The second step is to say thank you, period. Thank you. Let thank you be a full sentence. It's not thank you, but, or thank you. Oh, it's just, no, it's just thank you. And then the third step is you just give them a nice smile again. So let's practice. You game for that, Shannon? All right. You game?
Yes, this is very complicated. I may have to write this down again.
Right.
Okay, go ahead.
All right. I'll step you through it if you get stuck.
Okay.
Shannon, I had so much fun talking with you when we were on our brand builders breakout room. I learned a lot. That was a blast.
Thank you.
There you go. You can go off into the world armed with that knowledge now, everybody. Smile, say thank you, and then just smile again.
Yeah. And I think that returning a compliment of sorts too. I had a great time talking to you as well. Can't go wrong either.
Awesome. Yeah. Yeah. Thank you for saying that.
Yeah. So I think that, it's also accepting that thank you. I also feel this a little bit of pressure to say something nice back, like to reciprocate the compliment. Because I think it's almost like this, I'm a numbers person. So instead of, they give you 1 and then you erase it, go down to 0. I'm like, what if you just gave the 1 back? And like, now we're even, now it's balanced, It's like, oh, I can't handle that. Like you lobbed it over to my side of the net. Now I have to lob it back instead of just throwing it away.
Yeah. Right. And I mean, if it's a genuine, reply,
of course,
I think that's great.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But let's talk about, so imposter syndrome in the context of business. A lot of people will struggle with it. I know you've mentioned a few examples of folks that have really good credentials.
Yeah.
And, there are people listening who go, yeah, that's great. But like, I'm not a I'm even more of an imposter now, John, after hearing this, because even though I understand rocket scientists and Navy SEALs can struggle with this, I'm still just little old me running a business that started this on the side, and I don't have any credentials or letters on my name or all this stuff. And I'm struggling with this too. What are some tips you have for them on how to manage that when they don't have necessarily the proof yet?
Yeah. And one of the best ways to combat imposter syndrome is by taking action, by doing something. It's very hard to feel like an imposter if you're actually physically doing it or mentally doing it. And one of the other ways that I really steer people to turn down the volume of imposter syndrome, and I say turn down the volume because as with anything, especially when we're working on it, psychologically, it's not a switch, right? These are behaviors that have been practiced by us for probably as long as we can remember. So it would be folly to think that we can just turn it off by learning a few simple tricks. But what we're looking to do is turn down the intensity of the imposter syndrome. If it, paralyzes you, let's ratchet it down to the point where you can still move forward. And let's also increase the period between which it happens, like make it longer. If it happens 3 times a day, well, let's call it a win. If it happens, once every 2 days or once a day, whatever it is. And one of my favorite ways to help people turn down the volume of imposter syndrome is I call it creating your archive of awesome. Like keeping track of awesome things that you've done, not just recently, but throughout your entire life. Because the fear that comes with imposter syndrome or, who am I to do this thinking, it focuses on, where we are now. And then fear also loves to not play fair, right? Fear is going to bring something up that happened when we were, wee little folk as far back as we can remember. And it's going to trip us up all these decades later as adults. So I would say, look, if fear is not going to fight fair, we're not going to fight fair either. Because one thing I know about fear that it doesn't fight fair is that fear hates facts. Fear hates facts. So a lot of your people are probably numbers people. My former career, it was all about data. I did test operations, data. What's the data say? I don't care what your opinion is. If this is going to work, what's the data say? So I always tell people combat fear with facts. So I say write down, whether it's in a note in your phone or, they can sign up on my newsletter, which I send them, a PDF that they can fill out of their archive of awesome. Write down things, set a timer on your phone for 10 minutes. And as awkward as it's going to feel for the first 30 seconds, write down awesome things you've done. And they don't have to be magnanimous, right? They don't have to be like employee of the year or whatever. It can be like, I figured out how to set my dials correctly in my car. So the windshield actually, instead of, wiping the inside of the windshield the entire way to work. So write down big wins, little wins, even things that make you happy all the way from the beginning of your life, because that's why everything that I'm sitting in front of in my office are things that are special to me, or I've earned awards. That letter of commendation I mentioned about 10 minutes ago when I was almost in tears when I received it, it's now hanging behind me. It sat in an office desk drawer for the better part of a decade because I didn't feel like I earned it, but I wanted to be reminded of things. So right next to that letter of commendation is a medal I won when I was a Cub Scout for winning like the Pinewood Derby for a car my dad and I built together. And I got like a bronze medal because I wanted to be a reminder on those days where I walk into my office and I'm like, I don't think I can handle this shit in front of me today. I'm not up for it. I can look at that wall and be like, okay, these are hard facts. These are things I've done. So just believe you're that person for the next 2 minutes, John, and get on with your next task. And then believe it for 3 minutes and move on. That's why it's so important for people to write down these accomplishments that they've had throughout their lives, not just recently, to remind them on those days where they're like, who am I to start a business? Who am I to start a podcast? Who am I to call this person or to ask to be on their podcast? Just do it.
Yeah. And I did something kind of similar when I started my business, which I didn't know the impact it would have, but I did it as sort of a weird scrapbook type of approach.
Okay.
I decided to log in a Word document because I'm an accountant and we have Microsoft. I logged in a Word document. I logged in there my first 2 years of business. Coincidentally, I stopped after about 2 years, but my first 2 years of business, every I'm a little proud of this. Like we did this, like almost like a timeline of notches in my business, like going through the journey and saying my first podcast. So I put it's like baby's first podcast on July 2019. Like it was I don't have kids. So this is like my equivalent of those little chalkboards,
Gotcha.
It's like we have now done this. And what I did it because I wanted to remind myself of the momentum I was getting, every little milestone, but these things were a big freaking deal when I did them. So I remember I would only write down the big milestones when I was like, damn, that was awesome. Yes. Okay, cool. And I felt like it was like a springboard into the next chapter, but it would be like, I got this podcast and I actually opened this up a year later, a little time capsule. And I looked back at it and I was like, I thought these were big deals.
Yeah.
And they were.
Yeah, they were big deals then.
They were, and they are. But it was an interesting perspective to go, damn, I'm at a point now where that's not even a big deal anymore.
Mm-hmm.
I was rooting for my first podcast and I was praying for it. And I was like, oh my God, please let me get accepted into this podcast. I've done 70 now.
Right.
And I'm like, I really cared. And I still do. But it was just this so much more of this impact that each rep has on you.
Yeah.
And I think that when you mention that kind of archive of awesome, it reminds me of that, to go back and celebrate, let yourself celebrate the things instead of just looking at that as the closure of a chapter and on to the next thing. We do that so much as business owners. We just go, yep, cool. Thank you for that. Moving on. Next accomplishment. Hit my 100K. Next is 250K. Hit my 250. Next is 500. Next is 1 million. And you go can you just own that for a second? Congratulations.
Yeah.
And I think nobody's really congratulating us. I mean, some people are, but then we dismiss it. We're not really letting ourselves celebrate that. Do you agree?
Oh, 100%. One of the things that I still really work on, and I have to be very conscious of it, is celebrating things. And, there's so much to be said for people that have known you for a while. One of my friends named Jazz, she's over in the UK, and her and I, cut our teeth together when we were still doing side hustles and in the initial coaching programs. And we're like, oh my God, what have we gotten ourselves into? And all these years later, we've kept in contact. And every so often, if I put something out on my newsletter, she sees something on social media that I've done, I'll just get this little message from her. She'll be like, John, have you had a sandwich? And the reason why that's important is we were talking on a coaching call one time and it was like, what do you do to celebrate? And we're all like, no, I don't know. We're on to the next thing. And they made us come up with things that we were going to do to celebrate. And I said, well, I love sandwiches. They're my favorite thing. So I guess after I was launching a photography group at the time, I'm like, I guess after we have our first meeting, I'm going to go out for a sandwich. And she latched onto that. And that was like almost a decade later or a decade ago. So it's nice to have people, these cheerleaders, if you will, cheering you on, but then also, reminding you to celebrate and have these little rituals that you do.
Yeah, it's so important because it's a fundamental aspect of what we do as business owners that we move on to the next thing because we're always moving in a momentum, in a forward motion, I feel. And if you don't look around once in a while, you're like, what is it, Ferris Bueller now?
Yeah, I just watched that.
It's like if you don't look around, you might miss it.
Yeah, life goes pretty fast. Yeah, if you don't look around, you might miss it.
I think that's one of the most wise things I've ever heard, where it's like, I think it just goes, entrepreneurship goes pretty fast. If you just insert that word, it's like the most true thing ever. But I realized I was quoting him as I was saying it. I was like, I think I'm just quoting Ferris Bueller right now. So John, I have a question for you on the relationship between imposter syndrome and this statement that I hear all the time. I want to hear your thoughts on it.
Okay.
Everyone always says, be the dumbest person in the room.
Okay.
Or you want to strive to be the dumbest person in the room in the sense that you have the most to learn. How do you couple that with your thoughts on imposter syndrome? Is that creating an environment that could foster it? Or is that something that you think is worth pursuing because of the challenge it presents to somebody?
Great question. And I think like most things in life, especially when we're challenging ourselves, I think that comes down to how you're going to frame it. And me personally, I wouldn't deal well with framing it as I want to be the dumbest person in the room. I know I work much better if I frame it more positively. Like I'm getting ready to go into a room where I can learn an immense amount of knowledge. Because really, I mean, that's what the whole phrase is. It's to surround yourself with people that are going to inspire you to do better and that you can learn from. Whereas if you say, I want to be the dumbest person in the room, I've felt like that through much of engineering school. Not tremendously book smart. I only wound up with working in the space program, ironically, because I taught rock climbing. And that's a whole other story. So I always did feel like the dumbest person in the room, but I think it's so important to learn phrasing and to take a point of view that works well for you. That's why, like, when I work with one-on-one coaching clients, one of the first things I have them do is an Enneagram test and also a Myers-Briggs, because my coaching, I work specifically with men, and it's called the Authentic Men of Action. And it's to help guys understand who they truly are and like what lights them up, not so they can only do whatever it is that they want, but so they understand how they operate. That's why the Enneagram is such a powerful tool. Because I would say, the first thing we're going to do is we're going to understand your heart, your head, and your hurt.
Ooh.
Yeah. So people can understand why they react the certain ways they do. So some people, like my buddy Mike, I used to play in a band with, he's a type 8 if you're into the Enneagram stuff. The blunter, the better with this dude. Like, don't sugarcoat it. He's going to zone out and just not pay attention. As blunt as you can. But then our drummer in our band was very sensitive. So you couldn't be blunt or he'd shut down the opposite way. So it's all about knowing how you operate and what motivates you. Because some people could be like, yeah, I like that. I like feeling like the dumbest person in the room. Let's go. Let's do it. I'm going to learn some stuff. I'm dumb. Whereas like someone like me, I'm like, man, I already feel like I'm not supposed to be here. So I think that's great to challenge yourself. It's just very important to understand what motivates you personally, at how to frame it.
Yeah. And what you plan to take out of it and how you want to approach it too. Because I think if you take this advice for face value and you walk into a room that you already feel like you don't belong in, and then you kind of convince yourself that you're only there because you don't belong, there has to be a better intention behind it of like, what am I going to learn? What am I going to take away?
Right.
How am I going to leverage this room to my advantage? And I think people will say, you want to be the dumbest person in every room as a blanket statement. But what they're really trying to say is you want to be in places that stretch you.
Right.
But I think that some people can over apply that and maybe can foster or cultivate more imposter syndrome. So I think that's a really good answer. But as we kind of wind this down, John, I know you mentioned the Archive of Awesome.
Yeah.
So tell us more about how people can actually you mentioned that there was like a fillable thing that they could fill out. So talk to me about how people can get access to that.
Yeah. One of the things I really want to encourage people with is to take stock of these amazing things they've done. So if they go to my website, johnmollura.com, at the top there, it says, put your email address in, click here, and they'll get a PDF kicked out or emailed to them where they can fill it out in the PDF if they want, if that's their thing, or, Word doc, if you're an accountant and you're using Microsoft, or an engineer and you're stuck using Microsoft products. But the real impetus is to give people a reason to record some awesome things they've done. And that if they sign up for that, over the next 5 days, I drip out, some additional background information on how imposter syndrome shows up in ways they might not even know. And then some additional steps to turn down the volume of it.
Love it. So guys, check out the links in the show notes. We're going to have a link right to where you can download that. John, thank you so much for coming on the show today. And where else can people find out more about what you have going on? Any places that you're showing up online right now?
Yeah, absolutely. So if they sign up for my newsletter, I try to be pretty up to date about what I'm doing, podcast appearances, webinars, and things like that. But the more instant gratification kind of stuff, if we can call it that, on social media, Instagram, I'm just John_Mollura, and then Facebook, John Mollura Speaking and Coaching.
Amazing. Thank you, John, for coming on the show today.
I appreciate it, Shannon. Take care.
Everyone says you need to get a bookkeeper, but what good is that if you don't know how to read the financial statements they give you? If you're hesitating to ask questions on your numbers, or you're not even looking at them because you don't know how to turn them into actions, we're now offering an accessible option for you to get the support you need to use your financial statements effectively. It's called the CFO On Demand. You can bring your financials to a call with me or message me privately about what's going on with your business. We will even go over what documents you need to send your tax pro so you feel prepared and confident this tax season. Want to learn more? Head to thecfoondemand.com, and the link is down in the show notes. Again, that's thecfoondemand.com. Thank you so much for listening. If you enjoyed this episode, please leave a rating and review on your podcast platform. This small action goes a long way for podcasters to get our message heard by more business owners just like you. Be sure to check out the show notes for links to information about our guests and ways to get in touch with me. We'll see you on the next episode.